can find it in stores now.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And this, so it's pronounced as Barefoot Gen.
Gen, yeah.
Gen,
yeah.
okay. And this is about a child who witnesses the destruction
Right.
after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
Right. It's the semi-autobiographical story of the artist Keiji Nakazawa.
Yeah, okay.
And he survived mainly because he was standing behind a wall, and he was shielded partly from the blast by that.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's extraordinary.
Yeah, but he lost several members of his family, and of course, most of the people he knew in the city.
Right. Oh my God. How many people actually died in Hiroshima? Do you remember?
I think estimates vary. Obviously, at that level of destruction, it's pretty hard to get an accurate count. But I think it's generally believed to be from 80,000 to 100,000, and it depends how you count, because a lot of people, of course, died after the bombing from radiation disease or from illness, or
Right.
there are people still dying in Japan now from causes from ailments caused by the radiation.
Really?
Yeah.
That's extraordinary.
And it wasn't all Japanese; it was Koreans, and also there were Americans in Hiroshima as well.
Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, it reminds me of an anime.
Mm-hmm.
Grave. Oh, is it Grave
of the Fireflies?
Fireflies,
Right.
and that's a very. I've never seen it. I've
Right.
tried to avoid it because it seems like a very sad story
Right.
about people actually.
Yeah, it's
dying.
very sad.
Yeah.
And that's based on a famous novel in Japan. Actually, it's a very powerful anime.
Yeah. Now, talking about that, manga and anime,
Mm-hmm.
what's the real difference there? I mean, is there?
Well,
just
anime is just animation,
Mhm.
and in fact, it's just the Japanese contraction of animation, anime.
Right.
In Japan, in Japanese language, a lot of things people contract the words when they become really popular because it's too much trouble to say the whole thing. So
Right.
you just shrink it down.
Right.
It just means animation. It doesn't even mean necessarily Japanese animation.
Mm-hmm.
But in the United States now, of course, it has a different meaning. When people say anime, they mean specifically Japanese animation. So it's kind of an
Right.
interesting
Right.
evolution, sort of give and take of borrowing and cross-influencing of words. Manga is just the Japanese word for, today, for comics and comic books. But it actually, it's fairly broad. It's almost like the word cartoons in English, because it can mean comic strips. It can mean single-panel cartoons. It can mean comic books. And sometimes it can also mean animation in Japan, especially among the older generation.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. I know you mentioned a guy who Osamu Tezuka.
Yeah.
He's considered the god of.
Yeah.
Is that right? I mean.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, he's probably the most revered comic book artist in Japan, and he passed away in 1989. But he was extraordinarily influential, and he probably more than anyone else helped create the modern Japanese manga format, which is a little bit different than the American traditional comic book. It's more visual, and the stories are longer. It's more cinematic, you might say.
Right.
And he was a sort of powerhouse of the industry in the early days, especially in the late or the 1950s and 60s, and as long as he lived, actually.
Really. Did you have a chance? You met him. He wrote a foreword for your book, actually.
Yeah, he did,
yeah.
and I was very lucky. I worked with him. Actually, there's a picture in there somewhere of me standing next to him. But I was very fortunate. I knew him, and I worked as his interpreter when he would come to the States.
Yeah.
And
wow.
he wrote the foreword. He was a very generous person and very nice to me. And I've always felt very grateful for his for the kindness he showed me.
Oh wow! And he was didn't he write the story known as The Lion King? Wasn't he at the center of the controversy? Or there was a controversy with Disney. The Lion King was ripped off from the Japanese.
Yeah, he wrote it. He created one of his first big hits in Japan was called Janguru Taite, which means Jungle Emperor. And that was turned into an animation. He formed an animation studio and turned his comic books into animation in Japan, and he created an animated version of the story, which became the first color TV animated series in Japan. And in the United States, it was actually imported and it was shown here as Kimba the White Lion, under the title Kimba the White Lion. And people who know about Japanese anime and a little bit about history, of course, they were very offended when they went to see Disney's The Lion King, because there's a lot of similarities, and there was this huge controversy over whether the Disney people had borrowed a little too heavily, shall we say, from it.
Right.
And at the time, I think, for whatever reasons, mainly political, the Disney people were unable to acknowledge any influence at all. So they came out and they said, well, we were not influenced. We didn't use any of the imagery from the Japanese series. And it was just preposterous, of course, because it's, I think, quite well known that people in the animation industry, they refer to anything they can when they're creating, especially a furry animal, a series, where, especially if you have lions, you have to make a move, you want to look at what other people have done. So that was quite a controversy, and it was actually, it was quite an issue in Japan. It was in a lot of papers in the United States, but in Japan it was a major issue, and a lot of artists got together and sent a petition to the Disney distributor in Japan and protest. But of course, Disney never acknowledged any influence at all.
Is that right?
It's too bad, because they could have just had one little credit line and said something, we'd like to thank Osamu Tezuka for some of his ideas or inspiration.
Right, and they
but at that time, they couldn't do that.
I see.
Yeah.
It was kind of.
Now I think they probably would.
Yeah,
Then they could.
you would hope, huh?
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, let's see. The role of women in Japanese manga. It's mostly manga's been directed toward young men. Women, what's their?
Well, now it's pretty much 50-50, especially in terms of titles. If you look at the number of titles that are produced, it's pretty much split right down the middle. But it's true that in the early days, in the post-war period, it started out as mainly a medium entertainment for boys and then young men. But very quickly, more and more manga were created for girls. And very quickly, unlike the United States, the women artists started drawing the comics for girls. So you had a brief period in Japan where the male artists created comics for girls, but the women very quickly took over. And now almost all of the comics for girls and for women are created by women in Japan. Yeah,
it's interesting.
It's sort of an interesting phenomenon. Yeah.
Is that coming over here? Is there any influence in this?
Well, there are women in the United States who draw comics, and there are more and more, and some of them draw wonderful comics. But it's been much harder, I think, for females in the industry here than it has been in Japan.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And part of that is the fact that the readership here has been so skewed to young males, far more than in Japan. And hopefully that's going to change. But I notice in the conventions they have here in the U.S., the anime conventions, just the last few years, it's been really wonderful to see how the gender breakdown has changed. It used to be almost all young males, and now it's almost split down the middle. A lot of young American women are really into Japanese manga and anime.
Are they really?
Yeah.
Well, you see this thing at the conventions called cosplay.
It's not just costume play. Again, it's this contraction. Costume play. Cosplay. You just contract it. It gets too long to say, so you just contract it.
Right.
And a lot of young boys and girls and adult men and women, they love the cosplay. It's wonderful if you have a chance. I don't know if you've been to a convention, but it's...
Yeah, well, that's where I first there was one at Foothill a number of years ago, 96 I think it was when I first...
Was it Funime maybe?
It was Funime,
okay,
right.
Yeah. Because the cosplay has become sort of, I think, really central to all the American conventions. It's just wonderful.
Yeah, why is that? They dress up as their favorite characters, like Halloween.
Yeah, you just dress up as your favorite anime or manga character and
Is
go
that
out on stage.
Do they do that in Japan a lot too? I mean, there's.
They do it at the conventions, yeah.
At the conventions.